Chapter 1. Charlotte, daughter of the late Earl of Stenwick and sister of the current Earl of Stenwick, wandered the grounds of her childhood home, Stenwick Manor. She really hadn't wanted to spend any time rusticating in the country this close to the season beginning, but her mother had insisted she needed to see how Diana, Charlotte's new sister-in-law, was faring. Now that Diana was pregnant with the first of the next generation of Stenwicks, Horatia was doting on the girl. This was their third visit in as many months, and they stayed for 3 days at a time. She would rather be anywhere in the world than near her sister-in-law, but she knew that her feelings wouldn't be taken into account. They never were. She was just a daughter, made for nothing more than making a good match. She wished she could love their visits to her ancestral home, the home where she'd grown up and had so many memories, but with Diana around, everything seemed to be annoying to her. Charlotte shook her head. Lucy, her younger sister, spent all her time getting to know Diana while they were in the country. Charlotte had always been close to her younger sister, and it seemed that their new sister-in-law was coming between them. Why had everything gone to pot ever since Diana had married Percy? Why had he been willing to marry the title-grabbing little merchant's daughter anyway? Charlotte still wasn't fond of her sister-in-law. She'd been kind to her, because she didn't want to anger her brother, but there was just something that struck her as odd in the older woman. She couldn't put her finger on it, and if she mentioned it, she was immediately hushed. The whole family liked her, and Charlotte felt pushed to the side. She wanted to force her sister-in-law out of the picture, but what difference would it make? It's not like she would suddenly start matching if Diana were gone. She wandered to the small lake that was on the property and sank onto the bench that was in front of it. She liked the bench, an addition since Diana arrived, but she would never admit it. It seemed everything was always changing these days. Even her home wasn't the same because of Diana. Why she still resented her, she wasn't even certain, but she knew she did. She thought back to the night she'd first met the other girl. It was a party during the season 2 or 3 years before. Charlotte had been with the Viscount of Burgess, Miles. Miles was everything she'd ever hoped to find in a man, and she couldn't believe her luck. He was on the verge of proposing. Everyone said so. Charlotte had seen Diana walking toward them, the other woman focusing all her attention on Miles for a moment, before smiling at Charlotte and introducing herself. At first, Charlotte had been intrigued by Diana, because she'd heard so much about her, but that had changed in the twinkling of an eye. As soon as Diana had started talking, Miles had watched her like a lovesick fool, asking her to dance, trying to get her to go for walks with him, and generally forgetting Charlotte was alive. When questioned about his behavior the following day, he'd said he couldn't explain it. He'd felt such an outpouring of love for Diana, he couldn't stop himself. He'd even gone so far as to propose to her right there on the dance floor. Of course, Charlotte had refused to see him after that, but she'd secretly hoped he'd come back, begging forgiveness. He never had, though, and Charlotte was still alone, while Miles was now married with a son. She was practically on the shelf now, and it was all Diana's fault. Charlotte looked to her left and saw a huge fountain sitting beside the lake. She pulled her cloak closer around her to fight off the winds coming across the lake as she studied it. It was a chilly winter day, and she wanted to be anywhere but where she was, but she didn't have a choice. Why was it that choices were taken from women so often in life? She wandered closer to the fountain to take a look at it. There was something compelling about it, and she wasn't certain what it was, but it seemed to call to her. She stepped toward it and ran her hand over the stonework. It was beautifully done. Someone had painstakingly pieced the rocks together and created a work of art. Charlotte put her hands on the fountain and closed her eyes. Make a wish. The voice sounded like her sister-in-law, Diana's, but Charlotte knew she was in the house with Lucy and her mother, while Percy did whatever work he always did to support the family. She jumped back and looked around her. There was no one anywhere near her, so who had said the words? Who wanted her to make a wish? She put her hands back onto the fountain, and again heard the words, "Make a wish." She laughed at herself as she gazed at the fountain. No matter how beautiful it was, it couldn't really be telling her to make a wish, could it? She put her hands on it once more, and again heard the words. This time, she closed her eyes and wished with all her might. "I wish that I would find the man that was created for me alone. Please help me to find and marry my true mate before the end of the season." She knew tacking on before the end of the season was asking a lot, but another failed season just might be the death of her. She didn't say the words aloud, but they were there pulsing around her, just the same. She heard the words, "Your wish will be granted," filling her mind. She chuckled as she walked back toward the house in better spirits than she'd been in for days. Her wish would be granted. Everyone needed to have a wish granted every now and then. Right? Asterisk. Charlotte was still laughing at herself when she got back to the house. She found her brother, Percy, doing something with rocks. She had never really cared to know what he did to support the family, so they could keep their place in society, but suddenly it seemed to matter more to her than ever before. Stopping beside him, she looked at what he was crafting. "Is this how you support us?" she asked, her voice obviously interested. Percy nodded. "Some consider me an artist, but really? I'm just a stonemason, doing what I do to pay for your pretty dresses." He didn't sound like he begrudged her the work, though. He was never rude about the fact that he supported all their parties. He was simply matter of fact. Charlotte blushed slightly. She spent a great deal more on dresses than she really needed to. Her mother and Lucy were much more frugal, constantly aware that Percy was working for every thread. "You do beautiful work." She touched the birdbath he was creating, in awe of the detail he put into it. "Why do you still work, though? Diana brought so much money into your marriage that it makes no sense to me." He'd told her he would never touch the money, but she had a hard time believing that. Why marry a tradesman's daughter if not to use the money she brought to the marriage? Percy glared at her. "We've been through this before, Charlotte. I didn't marry my wife for her money. I married her because I love her. The money is in trust for our children. It won't be touched until then." She could see, just by looking at her brother as he said his angry words, that he was speaking the truth. Since she was a small girl, she'd seen shrouds of red over people when they lied. Percy wasn't lying at all. He truly loved Diana. That meant she must have some redeeming qualities, didn't it? "I'm sorry, I doubted you." Percy shook his head, obviously trying to dispel the anger that was overtaking him. "Don't be. It's just become a sore subject between Diana and I don't ever want her to believe that I only married her for her father's money." Charlotte considered that for a moment before nodding. "I can understand that. I'd feel hurt if I found out someone only married me for my dowry. Not that her dowry would be at all comparable to Diana's. Diana's family may have been from common stock, but they could buy and sell her family without noticing." Percy started to reach out to her, but pulled his hand back. "I'm a mess. You should go back inside and continue to pretend you know nothing about how I make my living." "Thank you," she said, standing on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. He looked at her in surprise. "Why are you thanking me?" "For working so hard to make up for what Father lost." "I don't think I've ever said that to you before." He stared after her in surprise as she went back into the house to join the others. Smiling, he got back to work. Asterisk. Lucy looked around at the ball, her eyes excited. Beside her, Charlotte wished she could have even a fraction of the enthusiasm her younger sister showed for the season. It was the opening ball and Charlotte was already tired of the endless parties. Why was this the only way for her to find a husband? It hadn't always been this way, and she thought it was stupid that it was required of young ladies now. "All the same people are here that have been at the last 100 parties we've attended." All the same mothers trying to marry all the same daughters to all the same young men. There is nothing new to see or do here. Charlotte bit her lip after letting the words escape, knowing that Lucy would be annoyed. Lucy looked at her. Are you having a bad night for some reason? Charlotte shrugged. Not really bad. I'm just tired of all the parties. Isn't that silly? I want to get on with my life. Never before had she been ready to give up the endless round of parties and just marry and be done with it. Now she was, and the parties had become annoying. This was the first of the season, and she should be happy. Instead, she just wanted to go home. Lucy was the only person in the world who knew about Charlotte's power to see whether others were lying, but of course, Lucy had her own power. She had the ability to see if someone had good intentions or not. It was odd, because she knew every time a gentleman spoke to a woman if he intended to be good to her, or if he just wanted to seduce her. So who's lying tonight? Charlotte grinned. It was a game they played at balls. Lucy would ask who was lying, and she would point out all the different ladies and gentlemen who were lying to their companions. She looked around the ballroom, searching for men who were lying to the women with them. As usual, the first person she saw was Anthony Lancaster, the Duke of Avondale. He was talking to someone, who appeared to be comforting him, with his eyes downcast. Why was he lying while he was being comforted? What was wrong with the man? Duke of Avondale, she said without thinking. She usually tried not to bring him up, especially now that he was single and on the prowl for a new mother for William, his almost 4-year-old son. She was disgusted by his perpetual lies, though, and couldn't help but mention him. The Duke and Duchess of Avondale had been the sweethearts of society for their entire marriage, and everyone had mourned with him when his wife, Gabriella, had died several months before. Gabriella had been sweet and gregarious, and everyone missed her a great deal. Some people looked down at Anthony for already searching for a new wife, but he had a young child, and to Charlotte that was perfectly understandable. What Charlotte couldn't understand was why the man always lied. As far as she was concerned, he seemed incapable of telling the truth. She'd met him several times when he was a child, coming to Stenwick Manor. He and Percy had been friends for ages, and she didn't remember him lying then, but ever since she'd been out, he'd worn the mantle of the liar constantly. Lucy looked at Anthony in surprise. Anthony? Percy's friend? Her eyes found him in the crowd. But, it looks like Lord Beaufort is comforting him. Why would he lie while someone was comforting him? Charlotte shrugged. That's what I'm trying to figure out. The man is incapable of telling the truth as far as I can tell. Charlotte had always been disgusted by lies and liars, one reason she was always so angry with her sister-in-law. She had no idea what tricks Diana played to keep her from seeing her lies, but she knew they were there. There was no other explanation for the woman's odd behavior. Well, don't look now, but he's coming this way. Charlotte didn't look. She didn't want him to see the disdain in her eyes, because she knew he was a good friend to her brother. A moment later, he was standing before her and Lucy. Lady Lucy. Lady Charlotte. She could feel his eyes on her. Charlotte curtsied slightly. Your Grace. Lucy curtsied as well. Your Grace. It's good to see you both here. He looked down at them, his eyes settling on Charlotte, who had yet to make eye contact with him. Would you care to dance, Lady Charlotte? He'd known them as children, so it was only his impeccable manners that had him calling them lady. Charlotte shook her head. No thank you. I'm tired and don't feel like dancing right now. She heard the gasp Lucy made as soon as she said the words, and she knew she'd made a huge mistake. She had no desire to dance, or do anything else, with a man who was constantly lying, though. Anthony's eyes narrowed. He couldn't believe she not only wouldn't look at him, but she'd refused to dance with him. Ever since Charlotte had started her first season, he'd watched her carefully. She was a beautiful woman, and he wanted nothing more than having her at his side. He took her hand and led her to the center of the floor, ignoring her refusal, and put his hand at her waist, using his other hand to grip hers firmly. She had no choice but to dance if she didn't want to stand in the middle of the dance floor and look like a crazed woman. Charlotte glared at his chest as she slid into an effortless waltz. Why had he insisted on dancing with her? She had no desire to be around him. Anthony sighed, keeping the perfect distance between them as they danced. Do you want to tell me why you won't even look at me? He hadn't spent much time with Charlotte in the past several years, but he remembered her as an affable child who had been friendly with everyone. He thought she'd even had a bit of a crush on him at one point. She shrugged, refusing to answer his question. How did one tell a duke that he was a liar and that made him beneath her notice? The answer, of course, was that she couldn't, but she wanted to. I'm going to keep you in the middle of this dance floor until you talk to me. He wasn't making idle threats either. He was going to make her talk to him if it killed them both. She shot a glance to his face to check his color, but he wasn't lying. There was a first for everything, right? I don't feel like you're the most truthful gentleman I've ever met, and I abhor men who lie. There. She'd said it. How would he react? He thought about her words for a moment, before nodding his head in agreement. I've found that I can't always be truthful. Would you be more willing to spend time with me if I promised that I would never be untruthful with you? She tilted her head to one side, wondering if he was even capable of making the statement without turning as red as she'd ever seen. I might, but I'm not making any promises. She didn't trust him. It was as simple as that. What did he want from her anyway? She couldn't promise that she'd agree to spend time with him, because she wasn't certain she'd ever be able to trust him, but she wouldn't say that she simply couldn't do it either. He sighed. I promise I will never lie to you, Charlotte. Will you at least try to believe me? How had she known he was lying anyway? No one was ever able to tell when he was lying to them. What did this girl know about anything? She seemed certain, though, so he would humor her. He never planned to lie to her anyway. She peeked up at him through her lashes and saw that he was telling the truth again. Twice in one night. That was excessive for him. I'll try, she said, knowing it would be very hard for her. He did seem to mean it when he said he'd never lie to her, though. What did he want anyway? He couldn't be interested in her. He seemed to read her thoughts. I want to get to know you better, Charlotte. Why? She knew it was rude, but she didn't care. What did he want from her? I'm very interested in you. I think you'd make a wonderful duchess and a good mother to my son. His words were blunt, because the conversation seemed to call for it. He wasn't lying. She stiffened. He was really interested in her. I don't know about that. Would she ever be able to trust him? The dance ended, and she pulled away from him, heading straight to the ladies' retiring room instead of back to her sister. She knew he wouldn't follow her there. She stood just inside the door, breathing hard, and glanced at herself in the mirror. What did he really want from her? Chapter 2. Charlotte sat in the parlor listening to Lucy drone on and on about the ball the previous evening. They'd all been there together. Did they really need to rehash it? She knew it was one of her sister's favorite things to do after a ball though, so she just tried to block out her voice. The Duke of Avondale seemed very taken with Charlotte until she ran from the dance floor like some demon was chasing her and hid in the ladies' retiring room for 15 minutes. Lucy grinned at Charlotte as she said the words, obviously knowing their mother would have something to say about Charlotte's behavior. Horatia, who had been somewhat lax in the chaperone department for a while, looked at Charlotte in surprise. Why would you do that? Everyone knows he's looking for his next duchess. Charlotte blushed but didn't say anything. She wasn't going to be the next Duchess of Avondale, whether her mother her to or not. The man just wasn't honest enough for her, and she wasn't going to compromise her morals and marry someone who would lie constantly. She hadn't been given her power just so she'd marry a liar. Obviously, it was to protect her from men just like him. Charlotte. Why did you run away from Anthony? Charlotte shrugged. I needed to use the retiring room in a hurry, and then I was embarrassed that I'd run off like I had, so I stayed in there so I wouldn't have to face him again. It was partially true, but it made her realize that she was being what she'd accused him of being. How would her mother ever understand, though? A knock on the door saved her from the conversation she didn't want to have with her mother. The Duke of Avondale is here to see Lady Charlotte. The butler bowed as he moved aside to allow Anthony in. Horatia got to her feet with a smile. It's good to see you, Anthony. You're looking good. How are you and William doing without Gabriella? Her voice was full of sympathy as she patted Anthony's arm. Anthony put on a sad face and looked down. We're making it through. We miss her every day. His voice sounded sad to Charlotte, but it was false. That made no sense at all. As Charlotte watched, a shroud of dark red covered him. He was lying about missing Gabriella? Was that why he lied so much? He didn't really care for his wife? Why would he keep up a pretense like that? Horatia patted his shoulder consolingly. Time will heal you. It was so hard for me right after George died. It does get better. Horatia turned red as well, but Charlotte was used to her mother's lies about missing her father. The couple had never really been close. Thank you, Anthony said. He turned to Charlotte and Lucy, and nodding to Lucy, he pulled a bouquet of violets from behind his back and presented them to Charlotte. How had he known her favorite flower? I was hoping I could convince you to take a walk through the park with me. Their town home was only a few streets over from Hyde Park, and she often walked there in the afternoons, which she knew he was aware of. She'd seen him there many times over the years, usually either walking by himself or with Gabriella and his 4-year-old son, William. It's too chilly for a walk in the park today, she told him, accepting the flowers. Thank you for the violets, though. She kept her voice as pleasant as she could, hoping her mother would accept her refusal. Horatia glared at Charlotte. It is not too cold for a walk in the park. Put your coat on. Anthony is in mourning, and if walking in the park with you will make him happy, you will walk with him right now. She looked at Anthony, shaking her head. I don't know what has come over her. Charlotte sighed. She obviously had no choice in the matter. I'd be happy to accompany you for a walk in the park, Anthony. It was true. She did want to go with him, but she didn't feel like it was a good idea. Lucy leaned over and whispered to Charlotte. His intentions are pure. Charlotte looked at Lucy in shock. Anthony was not only telling her the truth, but he had pure intentions? He was not the man she thought she knew. She got to her feet to get her coat from her bedroom, leaving Anthony to talk with her mother and sister. As she left, she heard Horatia apologizing for her behavior again. Charlotte isn't usually so ornery. I don't know why she would refuse to walk with you. I'll speak with her later. Oh, please don't. Anthony's deep voice rang out. I'll talk to her while we walk today. I want her to feel like she has the right to be honest with me. There's no reason for you to scold her for telling me the truth about not wanting to go. He knew there was more to it than she'd said, but he wouldn't tell her mother that. Charlotte took much longer than she should have fetching her coat, because she hoped if she kept him waiting too long, he'd just go away. No such luck. She could still hear his voice as she descended the stairs. Here she is now. No need to send Lucy. We're going for a walk in the park, but I'll have her back within 2 hours, he said. He noticed that Charlotte's maid was wearing her own coat, ready to accompany them. He opened the door for them and offered Charlotte his arm once they were outside. She took it, half afraid to touch him. Even though she knew he was bad for her, just touching him did funny things to her stomach. They walked slowly along the street that led to the park, her maid following 20 paces behind so as not to hear anything they may talk about, but always remaining within sight so they couldn't do anything inappropriate. I know you don't like me, but I do want to get to know you better. Maybe I can change your mind about me. I'm really not a bad man. Anthony stared straight ahead as he spoke, not willing to meet her eyes. He never thought that he'd be in a position to have to practically beg a woman to accept his suit. How had she reduced him to this? Charlotte sighed. I just don't feel like that would be in my best interests. I don't think I'd ever be able to trust you, and I can't have a relationship with a man I don't trust. She felt like she'd said the same thing to him over and over, but she didn't know how else to convince him. He looked down at her for the first time since they'd left the townhouse. Did Gabriella say something to you? Something about me? Or our relationship? They'd both been careful to make it look as if they had a perfect marriage, as much to save face as to just not hurt the other. He thought he was madly in love with Gabriella until they'd married. 2 months into the marriage, and neither of them had felt anything for the other any longer, but they'd kept up the charade. Neither of them had any desire to be pitted. There was no hatred between them, but they simply hadn't been able to live together amicably. She shook her head. Not a word. I don't know that I ever had any kind of conversation with Gabriella. Gabriella had been more of a social butterfly than Charlotte. She'd always been surrounded by the upper crust of society. Then what is it that frightens you so much about me? I'm not horrible to look at. I'm kind to small children. I almost never kick puppies. She grinned at the last. Almost never? So you do sometimes kick them? Only when they deserve it. She shook her head at his words. I just don't feel comfortable with you. That wasn't entirely the truth, but how could she tell him that she saw it when he lied to other people? Was there any way to say that without sounding insane? That's because you don't know me well. He took a deep breath, having decided the previous evening to invite her for a stay at his country home, but not certain how to go about it. I'd like you, and your mother and sister, to come and stay with me at my home in Bedfordshire for 1 week. That's enough time for you to get to know me and William. If you are still not interested in having anything to do with me, I will leave you alone. He held his breath as he waited for her to respond. He needed a mother for William, and a wife for himself, but he didn't it to be just anyone. He wanted Charlotte. Charlotte contemplated his offer for a moment, but she was too afraid she'd fall for him. She didn't want to spend time with him, because she was certain that with the way her body tingled every time he touched her, she would end up forgetting what she knew about him and falling in love. That couldn't happen. I don't think so, but I really appreciate the offer, she said politely. She didn't know how else to deal with him. He looked down at her and frowned. You're going to make this really hard for me, aren't you? I'm not trying to make anything hard for you. I'm just trying to protect myself. You don't need to protect yourself from me. He looked back at Abigail, her maid, who was still walking at a sedate pace behind them. He judged the distance to the trees, and debated with himself. Stopping, he turned to the maid and pulled a 5-pound note from his pocket. We'll be just inside the trees. You can have this if you wait on that bench. He pointed to a bench just on the edge of the woods and waited for her response. Charlotte frantically shook her head, but Abigail smiled and snatched the money. Thank you. She walked to the bench and sat with her back to the trees, looking out over the park. Anthony caught Charlotte's hand and pulled her into the trees just far enough that they couldn't be seen by the few others in the park. It really was a cold day, and most of the ton had been smart enough to remain indoors. He pulled her against him, his hands cupping her face. If you won't let me get to know you any other way, then I'll have to kiss you here. He knew he was being pushy, and she may never forgive him for it, but he needed to kiss her. He needed to prove to himself that there was something special between them, and he had to find some way to prove to her that H was different than the other men she'd been courted by. It was the only warning he gave her as his head descended and his lips caught hers. He kissed her softly at first, but when she didn't pull away, he stroked his tongue across her lips. When she opened her mouth to gasp, he swept his tongue into her mouth and kissed her passionately. Charlotte felt as if he had set her on fire. All at once, she wrapped her arms around him and invited his tongue inside for another kiss. All she could think of was the way he touched her, the way he kissed her. She felt a tingle of energy shoot through her body and into her nether regions. When he finally lifted his head, her lips were moist and pink from his attentions. She stared at him with wide eyes. What had just happened between them? "I don't want you to do that again," she said, lying through her teeth. She wanted him to kiss her again and never let go of her. She wasn't sure her knees would hold her, so she kept her arms wrapped about his neck, hoping she'd be able to stay on her feet. Anthony sighed. "I'll keep that in mind." He tucked her arm through his once more and walked her back to the townhome she shared with her mother and sister. He was going to have to go about this in another way. Now that he'd kissed her, there was no way he was going to let her go. He didn't care what he said. Chapter 3. Anthony stopped his horse in front of Stenwick Manor. He got down and walked his horse to the stable, giving the reins to a groom there. "Rub him down and give him some water. I'll be leaving within the hour to go back to London on him." He was more abrupt than he would usually be, but he'd made the trip as soon as an idea had formed, and he needed to get back before he was missed. He strode to the house and knocked quickly. He'd spent enough time at Stenwick Manor that he felt like it was a second home, and if Percy hadn't married, he would have walked right in without bothering to knock at all. When the butler opened the door, he pushed past him. "Is Percy in his study or out back?" He never knew if his friend would be pretending to be a stonemason or pretending to be an earl. You never could tell. "In his study, Your Grace." Anthony headed to his friend's study, not waiting to be announced. He had a plan, but it would only work if Percy was willing to help him. He pounded once on the closed door and opened it, grinning as he watched Diana jump away from Percy just as he opened the door. She'd obviously been sitting on her husband's lap, and moving couldn't have been easy with as far along as she was. "Don't mind me. Just need to talk to Percy for a minute." He loved seeing that there were marriages among the nobility where the couple actually liked each other. Diana blushed, patting her hair. "I'll just do something somewhere else." She rushed from the room, and Anthony laughed as she passed him. "I guess she doesn't think I know where babies come from?" He thought it was adorable, the way Diana ran from the room. Percy shook his head at his friend. "Stop embarrassing my wife and have a seat. We weren't expecting you." Anthony sat in the chair opposite his friend's desk and leaned back. "No, you weren't. I have a favor to ask." "How did you tell your best friend you had designs on his younger sister?" Percy raised an eyebrow. "A favor? What can I do for you?" It was there on his face that he was surprised, but anything that was in his power, he would do for his friend. "I have been trying to get Charlotte to pay attention to me. I've done everything but asked her to be my wife. She said I lie too much, and she can't trust me." He shook his head, trying not to show his frustration. Percy frowned. He'd never known his friend to lie, except to hide how he felt about his wife from the world. "You don't lie." He shrugged. "I know that, and you know that, but she will not believe it. I promised to never lie to her, thinking it would help, but it didn't. Anyway, I was hoping you'd host a house party and invite me. And your family, of course." He knew it was a lot to ask with his wife's pregnancy, but he also knew that if Percy could do it without hurting her, he would. Percy studied his friend, not answering immediately. "I'll need to talk to Diana about it." She may not feel up to hosting anything with as far along as she is. When is she due? Another 3 months, but she's not having the easiest time of it. Percy ran his fingers through his hair, musing it terribly. I'll let you know. Anthony frowned. Could you ask her now? Please? I need to come up with another plan if that one won't work. He knew he sounded desperate, and he was. He wanted to marry Charlotte before William got old enough that he wouldn't think of her as his mother. Percy nodded and stood. You've got it bad, don't you? Yes, I do. I'm not ashamed to admit it either. He wouldn't be telling his friend about the kiss he'd shared with his sister, but he wasn't ashamed of having feelings for her. I'll go talk to Diana. Percy left the room and closed the door behind him with a snap, going in search of Diana. He found her in the small parlor at the back of the house, knitting needles in her hand. She looked up at him and smiled. Is Anthony staying for supper? I have no idea. I have to ask you something, though. He sat beside her on the couch and caught her hand in his. What do you think of Anthony and Charlotte as a couple? His eyes were intense as he watched her, waiting for a reaction. He wasn't really worried about hosting the party, because there was no doubt she'd do it. It was just a matter of whether or not she thought they were a good couple. Her face lit up at the question. I think there's no man in the world who will make her half as happy as Anthony. Really? You're sure? She nodded. I've thought about telling you since Gabriella died, because I've been dying to throw them together, but I knew he needed time to at least make the pretense of mourning. Well, then, how would you feel about throwing a house party next weekend? I know we both hate parties, and there's a good reason for it, but for some reason, Charlotte won't give Anthony the time of day. He keeps trying, and she just won't listen to him. She keeps saying he's a liar. Diana frowned. I'm not sure what's going through her head. She's never been one to confide in me. Diana knew that wasn't being fully truthful, but he knew his sister didn't feel any love for her. Yes, let's have the house party. Make sure Anthony brings William and the nurse, of course. He's going to need William to win her over. Percy kissed her quickly and strode from the room, going straight back to his office to talk to his friend. She says a house party would be fine if we do it next week. Anthony sighed with relief. That sounds perfect. He couldn't wait to get the ball rolling. He desperately wanted to be married to her. He knew she would make the change he needed in his household and with his child. More than that, though, he needed her. He needed her vibrancy and her love. She won't do it unless you bring William, though. You know, she got really close to him when we were there for the funeral. I remember. I'll bring him and his nurse. He stood. Thank you. I'll expect your invitation. He was relieved that his friend was going along with his plan, but he really didn't have any more time to waste that day. He needed to get back to London before he was missed. Aren't you at least going to stay for dinner? Percy had never known Anthony to make a ride like that and leave so quickly. Anthony shook his head. No, I know which ball your sister is attending tonight. I need to make sure no other men are trying to capture her attention. Percy laughed, shaking his head. You're a duke. Stop acting like a lovesick puppy. I'm not sure that I can. Anthony raised his hand in a wave as he reached the door. I'll see you next week. Diana came in just after Anthony left. He's not staying? Percy grinned as he shook his head. He needs to be at the same ball Charlotte will attend tonight to be sure no one else is interested in her. He's got it bad. I knew he would. You sure they're right for each other? Percy was obviously skeptical. Have I ever been wrong? Asterisk. Charlotte stared out the window at the same old scenery they passed every time they traveled between London and Stenwick Manor. She was still annoyed that Percy and Diana were throwing a country party and demanding their attendance. Neither of them even liked parties, and Diana was much too far into her pregnancy to be hosting a party. What were they thinking? She looked over at her mother, snoozing in the coach while Lucy read a book. Lucy was always reading a book, which was probably why she and Diana got along so well. They were both bookworms. Charlotte was more of an outdoors girl. She preferred to spend all her time walking around outside, but when she had to dress for a ball, she did it without complaint. When they walked into the house, Diana's eyes immediately traveled around the great hall to see who all was there. Her mother had told her they were arriving a day early, but she hadn't been certain. Horatia and Diana would be sharing the duties of hostess to make things easier on Diana. Charlotte thought the whole party was ridiculous anyway. She went up to her room and changed, planning a long walk on the estate. The best part of being in the country was the country air, and she was determined to take advantage of it. She walked along the lake and then went and sat in the gazebo, wishing she'd brought her book. She loved to read, as long as she could do it outdoors, and there never seemed to be enough time to do it. Her mother thought all her time during the season should be focused on husband hunting. Charlotte thought her mother needed to accept the fact that she was firmly on the shelf. She sat in the small swing in the gazebo facing the house. The swing was a new addition since Diana as well, but this one she didn't mind so terribly much. She closed her eyes and enjoyed the brisk wind and the smells of the country air. The worst thing about living in London, for her, was the way it always smelled. She would love to spend more time in the country if it weren't for Diana taking over her brother's home. She was startled when the swing stopped abruptly. Looking up, she saw Anthony standing over her, holding the swing still with one hand while his other held the hand of a little boy. She smiled down at him. "William?" Holding her hands out, she scooped him into her lap. The little boy looked at her and smiled. "I think your papa needs to push us." "What do you think?" William nodded, his blonde hair flopping. "Push us, Papa." Anthony looked down at the two of them and couldn't conceal a smile. "Your wish is my command," he said, pushing the pair slightly until the swing started rocking. "I'm glad you came to my brother's party," she told William. "I'm Charlotte." "Lady Charlotte," Anthony corrected from behind her. William looked at her with a smile. "Hello, Lady Charlotte." He was so proper that Charlotte just wanted to gather him close. She hoped he wasn't always forced to behave perfectly and actually had some time to behave like a little boy. "Did you bring your nurse with you?" she asked the boy. William nodded, wrinkling his nose. "Papa said we couldn't leave her behind." He leaned forward just a bit to whisper in her ear. "I wanted to leave her behind, though. She makes me behave." Charlotte smiled. Papa was probably right. "I'm so glad we're here. I'd love to be your friend." "That would be very nice." William put his hand into hers. "Would you like to see where I used to play when I was a little girl and lived in that giant house?" "The house isn't as big as my papa's house," William told her. "Oh, I'm certain it isn't." She'd never been to his family's estate, but she was certain it was huge. The boy's father was a duke after all. She waited as Anthony stopped the swing, and then, taking the boy's hand, she led him across the grounds to a small maze. It was cut shorter than most mazes, as it had been when she was a child. She could easily see over the top, which was what her nurse had liked, but the child couldn't see out. William looked at it and clapped excitedly. "A maze?" Charlotte nodded. "Would you like to try it?" She still remembered exactly how to make her way through it, and she could now see over the top anyway. She'd spent hours learning the maze as a child. "Oh, yes. Do you want to try it alone, or would you like me or your papa to go with you?" she asked. "I want to do it by myself." He strode proudly toward the opening, turning back just before he reached it. You'll help me if I get lost? Charlotte smiled and nodded. Of course, I will. She watched as he started through the maze, and then she turned on his father, hissing under her breath. You convinced Percy to throw this house party so we would be together, didn't you? She'd been angry with him from the moment she'd seen him, but little William didn't need to know about it. Anthony thought for a brief moment about lying to her, but he remembered his promise. He would never lie to her. Yes, I did. I rode out here one morning and begged him to throw a house party and invite me, so that we would have to spend time together. He touched her cheek with the back of his finger. I couldn't get you to talk to me any other way. He knew it was a feeble excuse, but it was the truth, and she seemed to place great store in the truth. Charlotte took a step back, wanting him to touch her so much that she knew she must remove herself from his reach. Do my feelings not matter to you at all? I told you I didn't want to spend time with you, and you did this anyway? She was angry with herself and with him. Yes, she knew why he'd done it. He'd made it clear that he wanted the time with her, and she had refused to spend it with him over and over. He sighed. Your feelings matter to me a great deal. I want to spend time with you and get to know you. I want you to get to know my son. If I didn't think you'd hate me for it, I'd go to Percy now and ask for your hand. He let the words that Percy would agree in a heartbeat unspoken, because they both knew it was true. She shook her head, because she knew Percy would agree to the match. How could he not? The man wasn't only a duke, he was her brother's closest friend. I don't want you to force a marriage. Then spend some time getting to know me. Please. She sighed. You have until the end of the house party. She knew it would only last for 3 days. If he could change her mind about him in just 3 days, she'd be shocked. Thank you. His hands took hers, and he looked deep into her eyes. There's never been another woman in my life that I've felt as strongly about as I do you. She shook her head. Why does everyone think you were madly in love with Gabriella? You weren't, were you? He stared at her in surprise. No, but no one knows that. Only your brother. Did he tell you? He couldn't imagine Percy betraying his trust that way, but if she said he had, he would have to believe her. She shook her head. No. He never would. She thought about how to tell him enough so he'd understand, but not think she was crazy. I can sense when someone is lying. Whether to me or anyone else. I've seen you lie countless times from across ballrooms. I think I know what you've been lying about after you lied to my mother in our parlor last week, acting as if you were upset over your wife's passing. He looked at her for a moment. So you're telling me that you can tell without a doubt when I'm lying and when I'm telling you the truth. How was that even possible? It did explain why she didn't trust him, though. He'd rarely been truthful to anyone in a ballroom. For years, he'd lived under the mantle of trying to keep the true nature of his marriage a secret. Charlotte nodded. It's something I've always been able to do. I was 3 when my mother died. I thought she'd done it on purpose to get away from me. That's a lie. She looked at him as he nodded to confirm. I was 4 when my mother died. I thought she wanted to get away from me. She put her hand on his arm. I'm sorry you had to go through that. He knew he'd delivered each statement the same way, so she must be right. She knew somehow. I guess I'll never be able to throw you a surprise party. He said the words with a slight grin. He was puzzled that she could detect his lies, but it didn't bother him. No, you won't. She bit her lip then as she realized that he was acting as if the two of them marrying was a foregone conclusion. Are you trying to trick me into something? He shook his head. Never. I just want to spend the rest of my life with you, so I'm going to talk as if it's going to happen. He turned from her for a moment and called, You doing all right in there, William? He refused to become so wrapped up in conversation with her that he forgot about his responsibilities to his son. "Yes, Papa. I'll find my way out." Charlotte grinned as she listened to the little boy's voice calling to his father. She couldn't wait to get to know him better. The father she could do without, but the little boy had already won her heart. "He likes to be independent, doesn't he?" Anthony nodded. "He makes his poor nurse crazy, always thinking he can do everything on his own. She's not sure how to handle him half the time." Charlotte shrugged. "That answer is easy. Handle him with love. Always with love." She turned and walked to sit on the bench outside the maze, shivering a little. She'd forgotten to grab a coat when she'd stepped outside. He noted her shivers and shrugged his suit jacket off, putting it around her shoulders. "Do we need to go back inside?" he asked. Charlotte shook her head, snuggling into the warm jacket, inhaling his scent on it. "I wouldn't make William leave the maze for anything. He's enjoying it altogether too much to tear him away." She loved the idea of William spending time in it just as she had. He was a sweet boy, and she wanted him to enjoy his visit to her home. Anthony took the spot beside her on the bench, sitting as close to her as he thought she would allow before getting angry. "Thank you for taking an interest in him. He still misses his mother a great deal." Despite all their problems, they had both loved William beyond words. "I wouldn't have it any other way," she told him, patting his arm. "Do you miss his mother?" She was relatively certain she knew the source of his lies, but she knew that question would tell her everything she needed to know. Anthony thought about the question for a moment. "Yes, in some ways I do. Gabriella was a good mother to William. She and I were never able to get along as well as most. She was headstrong and had to have things her way, and it was different than the way I wanted things. We yelled at one another a lot, but yes, I do miss her some." Charlotte could see he was telling her the truth, and she was pleased by that fact. "Did you ever love her?" He shrugged. "The match wasn't made for love. Her father and my father set it up. Her father wanted her to marry a duke, and my father wanted the huge dowry she brought to refill the family's coffers. I thought I loved her for a time, but I knew within a month of marrying her that I never had." "Would you marry her again if you knew that?" She always wondered what people would do if they could go back in time and change things once they knew how they would turn out. He shrugged. "I probably would. I'd do it for my family. I wouldn't want to, and I'd probably drag my feet a lot more. I wouldn't give up William for anything, though. The little boy meant so much to him. He knew how much time he spent with his son wasn't the norm, but he just didn't care. He loved him." He told her the truth with each answer, which made her trust him a bit more. "I'm glad. I think he's a really sweet boy." He took her hand in his and brought it to his lips. "I never felt half as much for her as I do for you. I realized as soon as you were out why I had such a hard time with my wife. She wasn't the right woman for me. You were." He'd watched her when he was certain no one would notice, and no one had as far as he knew. Gabriella certainly hadn't known, or she'd have thrown it at him every time they'd argued. She stared at him for a moment and sputtered. "But, you never." "I couldn't say anything. You were a beautiful young woman with your whole future ahead of you, and I was married to someone else." He shrugged. "It didn't stop how I felt for you." Had it been right to be in love with her while he was married to Gabriella? Probably not. But he had never acted on it, and he knew that was right. That's not possible. How could he have had feelings for her for so long, and she'd never even noticed? He laughed. "You said you could tell when a man was lying. Am I lying to you?" She shook her head, her eyes not leaving his. "Well, no, I don't think so. How could it all be true, though? Everyone knew he'd loved his wife. He'd never once strayed." Charlotte was so stunned by his words, she didn't know what to do. Give me a chance? Please? Let me show you how much you mean to me. She bit her lip. I already told you I'd give you the whole house party. He smiled, leaning down and capturing her mouth with his. She met his lips eagerly, her lips parting for his tongue. Wrapping both arms around him, she pulled him close, kissing him back for all she was worth. She didn't see herself ever trusting him completely, but if she could have this weekend with him, she would rack up all the memories she could. Papa? Why are you kissing Lady Charlotte? Charlotte stiffened and looked down at the little boy watching them curiously. You found your way out of the maze. Good job. Papa? Anthony groaned, wishing changing the subject would work for William. Because she's pretty. Don't you want to kiss pretty girls? William looked at Charlotte and nodded slowly. But pretty girls never kiss me. Charlotte leaned over and picked William up, Anthony's coat falling from her shoulders as she did. She kissed the small boy right smack on the mouth. No one ever kisses you? Never? William smiled, looking at his father. She kissed me, Papa. His face was filled with excitement. Anthony grinned at the sight of the pair. So she did. She's supposed to only kiss me, though. He gave Charlotte a mock scowl that had them all laughing. William frowned. Why's that? Because I have special feelings for her. You do? Anthony nodded. I do. Do you want her to be my new mama? William looked back and forth between them as if he were trying to decide how he felt about what his father was telling him. I do want that. I don't think she does yet, though. Will you help me convince her? He knew he was playing dirty by bringing his son into the mix, but at this point he was willing to use everything at his disposal. William took the question very seriously, and after a long pause, he nodded. I do need a new mama, he told her. You should marry Papa. Charlotte hugged him close, glaring at Anthony over his shoulder. He was playing dirty, and she really didn't like it. We'll have to see. I need to make sure your papa treats you well, so I can see if he'll treat me well. She tilted her head to the side. Does he ever raise his voice to you? I could never marry a man who raised his voice to a boy as special as you are. William shook his head, taking the question very seriously. Never. He does make me stay with Nurse more than I'd like, though. You don't like Nurse? William sighed. She's nice, but she doesn't love me like family would. Charlotte smiled, resting her forehead against the little boy's. Even if you had a new mama, you'd still have a nurse. She didn't want him to think that if she, or anyone else, married his father there wouldn't be a need for him to have a nurse any longer. I know, but I could spend less time with Nurse and be with my new mama too, right? Yes, you could, Charlotte answered. Then I want you to be my new mama. Think about it. He scrambled off her lap and looked at his father. You need to spend more time alone with Lady Charlotte. I'll go back to Nurse now. Charlotte bit her lip to keep from laughing. As annoyed as she was with Anthony for suggesting he help her decide to marry him, she was charmed by William. He was a sweet boy, and he deserved to have a stepmother who loved him. She watched as Anthony and William went off in search of William's nurse and slipped away to her room, picking up his jacket and taking it with her. She'd see to it later that he got it back. Chapter 4. Charlotte saw Anthony at dinner that evening, but because the party hadn't officially started it was informal. He'd been at their home so much that he was simply treated as if he were a member of the family. They all sat together in the parlor before the meal, waiting to be called in, and he sat beside her. Why did you bring William with you? I would have thought you'd leave him town for a party like this. How could he expect to really court her with his son around? Anthony shrugged. I take him along whenever I can, and your brother told me he should come. Who was I to argue? Diana walked by then, smiling at them both, her belly preceding her. Is there anything I can get for you? She asked, her voice sweet and false-sounding to Charlotte. Charlotte shook her head, refusing to meet her sister-in-law's eyes. She realized that her problems with Diana were in the past, but she just couldn't trust the other woman. Anthony could feel the tension between the two women, but he had no idea what was wrong. Nothing for me, but I do want to thank you for inviting William and me to your party. He didn't thank her for throwing the party at his request, but he'd done that earlier. Diana smiled. I'm glad you could both come. William's a sweet boy. He was really happy to see you again. You made the week following his mother's death much easier for him. When Gabriella had died, Percy and Diana had rushed to the capital to spend a full week with them. Diana had kept William with her, helping him through it all, while Percy had been beside Anthony. I was happy to help in any way I was able to, she said as she walked away to check on the others. Why don't you like Diana? Anthony asked Charlotte, his voice low. Charlotte shrugged, wondering how much she should admit to. She's odd. How could she really explain how she thought Diana was able to block her powers, and how she had some strange way of controlling men? Everyone's odd in some way. It's what makes each of us unique. Try again. He could see she was hiding something, and he didn't like it. He knew most people in society disliked Diana, but he couldn't understand why. She seemed like a genuinely sweet, loving woman to him. Charlotte looked down at her hands for a moment and finally met his eyes. I had a beau 2 years ago that was close to proposing. Miles told me he was going to ask Percy for my hand the next day when we arrived at a ball one night. She leaned back on the sofa, squirming a little under his gaze. She didn't like talking to him about this at all. Not long after we arrived, Diana came across the ballroom. I hadn't really disliked her before then, but I didn't know her well. As soon as she approached, he all but fell at her feet. It was as if I no longer existed to him, for no real reason that I could understand. I don't know what she did, or why she did it, but I don't trust her. Miles Devon? He hadn't heard anything tying her name to Miles, but he knew the man was a scoundrel. He'd had his name attached to more young ladies in London than Anthony could count, and never in a good way. Charlotte nodded. He married someone else a few weeks later. You were well rid of him. He was forced to marry, because he got the brown chit pregnant. He wondered why no one had bothered to tell her that. Charlotte's eyes widened. I never heard that. That type of thing is generally kept from the ears of young innocents. He studied her. Do you still have feelings for Miles? She shook her head adamantly. I honestly don't know that I ever did. I do know that he was kind to me, and very charming. She didn't know how to explain her feelings for Diana now, because even without Miles involved, she couldn't trust the other woman. I've heard rumors about that kind of thing with Diana, but I always felt as if the women she victimized were better off without the beaus she saved them from. I know that's strange, but I almost think she was helping people. He shook his head. I have no proof. I can't back that up, but that's what I think. Charlotte thought back to the women she knew it had happened with, and she frowned. Was he right? I don't know. I just think it's odd she has some kind of strange power over men. Even if she does, is she hurting anyone with this odd power? I mean, you can tell if someone is lying. Some people would consider that odd, wouldn't they? They might. Charlotte knew they would. That's why she didn't talk about it in public. He obviously believed what he was saying, though. I've never been able to detect a lie in Diana. He shook his head. Has it occurred to you that maybe she just doesn't lie? She frowned. Everyone lies sometimes. Everyone. Even she lied, though she probably wouldn't admit it aloud to him. Have you seen me lie since I promised I would never lie to you? He asked. Just the once with my mother. Maybe she's just a very honest person. You need to give her a chance. Percy loves her a great deal. It must be hard for him to know that his sister can't abide his wife. Charlotte looked down at her hands. She'd never thought of Percy's feelings in the matter at all. Anthony was right. She needed to give Diana a chance. I'll do my best. I appreciate that. I know Percy will as well. Anthony hadn't expected to play the role of peacekeeper between Charlotte and her brother and his wife, but he certainly didn't mind. He had enough respect for both Percy and Diana that he wanted nothing but the best for them. At dinner, he sat beside Charlotte and spoke to her softly, keeping her attention away from the other diners. It was a good thing, because everyone was fawning over Diana and discussing possible names for the baby. It was obvious, at least to Anthony, that the whole thing bothered Charlotte. He was happy to have her to himself, though. She glanced down at the laughter at the other end of the table, and he raised an eyebrow. Lucy and I were much closer before Diana came along, she said with a sigh. She missed the friendship she'd shared with her sister. After getting over her adolescent annoyance she'd felt, she knew that Lucy was now her closest friend and confidant. Yet another mark against Diana? Charlotte shook her head. I'd like it to be, but it's not Diana's fault that she and Lucy get along so well. I'm glad you can see that. Anthony gripped her fingers under the table where the others wouldn't see. Would you walk with me after supper? Mother wouldn't approve. Maybe Lucy could go with us? Or your maid? I have another £5 note in my pocket. He wiggled his brows at her, and she stifled a giggle. Charlotte glanced down to see if her mother had heard that. We shouldn't. He shrugged. Sometimes being a duke means it doesn't matter a great deal if you do what you should or shouldn't do. Sometimes it's all right to go for a walk after supper with a woman you want to get to know better. She shook her head, worried about what the others would say. I can't. Anthony frowned, looking down to the other end of the table. Lady Stenwick, would you mind if I took Charlotte for a stroll after dinner? Just through the grounds? He knew the older woman had a soft spot for him, and not only because he was a duke. Horatia seemed to think about the question for a moment before nodding. That sounds fine. She looked at her daughter. Make sure you take your maid. Charlotte glared at Anthony. He'd like it if her maid went. She wasn't any kind of chaperone. Well, I guess you'll be getting your way again, Your Grace. She didn't know why she even bothered to tell him no when he found it so easy to get around her. The way she said his formal address maddened him. I suppose I will. He said nothing else as he finished the food on his plate. After the meal, they split up with the men going for brandy and the women stepping into the parlor to talk. Lucy frowned. Why don't I ever get to go for brandy with the men? Lucy folded her arms over her chest, obviously annoyed that it was a part of life that was completely closed off to women. Horatia was aghast. You know better, Lucy. I can't believe you even asked such a thing. Lucy shrugged. It's only family in here anyway. Horatia glared at Lucy. Anthony is not family. Lucy's eyes danced. Not yet anyway. He wants to be. Charlotte blushed but did her best to ignore her sister. She'd had years of practice, so she was quite good at it. Diana sat down on the couch and carefully put her feet up. Charlotte looked down at her sister-in-law, thinking about the conversation she and Anthony had earlier. Does being pregnant make your feet hurt? She'd never really been around a pregnant woman much, because they typically retired to the country during their pregnancies. Diana looked surprised by the question, but shook her head. Not really, but weighing so much more makes them hurt, and they keep swelling. The physician told me that if I put them up when I'm able to, I'll do better. Charlotte sat beside Diana. Did you decide to host this party because Anthony asked you to? She wanted to know if her sister-in-law would lie to her. Diana nodded slowly. Partly because he asked me to, and partly because I can see the two of you will be a good match. I want you to be happy." Charlotte frowned as nothing changed about the other woman's coloring when she said that. "Tell me a lie," she insisted. She knew it sounded crazy, but she didn't care. She had to get a true measure of her sister-in-law. Diana looked stunned for a moment, but she nodded, obviously not willing to argue. "My name is Roberta Alexandra Smith, and I like to suck my thumb all day and read historical treatises." To Charlotte's amazement, her sister-in-law turned red like everyone else did when they lied. "Were you trying to help me when you talked to Miles and me that night at the ball, and he only paid attention to you?" "Yes, I was." "You wouldn't have been happy with him." Diana didn't have the red haze, and she met Charlotte's eyes. "But you think I'll be happy with Anthony?" Charlotte didn't know why she suddenly believed her sister-in-law had her best interests at heart, but she knew she did. "I know you will." Diana's face was filled with confidence. "Thank you." Charlotte didn't know if she was thanking the other woman for her interference 2 years ago or for the party. She only knew she deserved her thanks. Diana smiled, her hand grasping Charlotte's. "I so want us to be friends, and not just sisters." Charlotte smiled. "I'll do my best." Suddenly she had a desire to get to know Diana, a desire she'd never had before. The men entered the room then, and Anthony raised his brow when he saw Charlotte and Diana sitting together grasping hands. Charlotte stood. "I'll go get my maid." As she passed Anthony, she whispered, "So you can bribe her with another $5." She hurried up the stairs, leaving the family in the parlor with Anthony waiting for her. When she reached her room, she changed out of her slippers into some good walking shoes and grabbed a shawl. It was too cold to walk with no wrap. Abigail was sitting on a chair reading a book. "You need to come for a walk with the Duke and I. I think he's planning to bribe you again." Abigail's eyes lit up. "I do like the extra money the Duke brings in." Charlotte shook her head. "I'm sure you do." Her mother would be terribly angry if she knew Abigail was taking money to not do her job properly. Of course, she liked Anthony's kisses. 5 minutes later, they were back in the parlor, and Anthony put her arm through his. "We'll be back shortly," he told her mother, before walking with her out of the room, Abigail once again trailing behind them. When they reached the gazebo, he pulled the £5 note he had in his pocket out and handed it to Abigail. "We'll be back by to get you before we need to be back at the house." Abigail nodded eagerly, taking her seat on the bench and looking toward the house. Anthony slipped his arm around Charlotte's waist and led her toward the lake. "There's nothing more beautiful than a lake at night. Yours used to fascinate me as a boy. Your family home isn't on a lake?" She loved the lake and always had. She had played there as a child and even learned to swim in it when she was small. He shook his head. "I forget you've never been. I feel like our lives have been entwined since I was a boy, with me visiting so often, but it was only Percy who visited, not you." She nodded. "I was never invited." "Not that she should have been." He laughed. "You make it sound as if I did something wrong by not inviting you, when we both know your mother never would have allowed you to go with him to visit me. Besides, when we were off at Eton, and visiting back and forth, you were just a little girl." "I think I've grown up," she said with a look up at him through her lashes. "Yes, you have grown up beautifully." He stopped at the lake, looking at the fountain standing there. "This is new." "One of Percy's designs?" He eyed it interestedly. He'd seen some of Percy's work, but this surpassed anything his friend had ever done. "I believe so." She looked at it for a moment before looking up at him in surprise. "You know he's a stonemason?" He laughed. "Of course, I do. He's my closest friend. We tell one another everything. I came out here right before the season started, and I felt as if this fountain spoke to me," she told him, slightly embarrassed. Anthony looked at her in surprise. And just how does a fountain speak to one? Charlotte shrugged. I can't really explain it. I kept hearing a voice telling me to make a wish. So I did. She didn't mention it was Diana's voice she heard, because that would be truly crazy. He looked at her with surprise. And has your wish come true? She shook her head. Not yet, but I think it might be progressing that way. He looked thoughtful for a moment. I think maybe I should wish on it as well. He walked closer, putting his hand on the stonework. He heard a female voice, like Diana's, telling him to make a wish. I do think you're right, Charlotte. This fountain wants us to wish upon it. He closed his eyes as if he were concentrating with all his might. Instead of speaking his wish aloud, he thought it, because it pertained to her. I wish that all of the obstacles Charlotte sees in our way would disappear, and she would agree to become my wife before the end of the party. He opened his eyes and hugged her to him. Now let's see if my wish come true. What did you wish for? She asked. He shook his head. I can't tell you that. It would make my wish pointless. I have a feeling this fountain only grants one wish per customer. I don't want to lose out because I was indiscreet about it. He looked down at her and toward the gazebo, which was barely visible in the dark. You agreed to get to know me better this weekend. Does that mean in every way? His hand stroked her cheek gently, as if asking permission. That depends on what you mean about every way. She could see his face, just barely, in the dark. She tilted her face up to his, hoping that he meant to kiss her again. His lips swooped down and took hers, kissing her ravenously. His hand stroked down her back as he pulled her closer to him, flattening her breasts against his hard chest. She wrapped both of her arms around him and kissed him back for all she was worth, her mouth parting to accept the caress of his tongue against hers. She felt weak in the knees as feelings of desire shot through her body, her entire body tingling. He lifted his head and looked around, catching her hand and pulling her toward the bench that was beside the fountain, collapsing onto it, and pulling her down with him. He began kissing her again immediately. You were made for me. She pulled her lips from his, panting slightly. How do you know you weren't made for me? She asked, her voice slightly belligerent. He chuckled, whispering, we were made for each other, just as his lips descended to hers again. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Charlotte ignored his words, kissing him instead. She didn't know how she felt any longer, so much having changed in the course of a day. She'd sort it all out later, when they weren't kissing. Finally, after what seemed like both an eternity and only a minute to Charlotte, he raised his head, his eyes full of fire. We need to get back to the house, before they send out a search party. If they find your maid across the grounds from us, we'll have to marry whether you like the idea or not. He wanted to marry her enough to keep her there, but he wouldn't compromise her in any way. He had too much respect for her. He got to his feet and took her hand, slowly leading her back toward the house. He wrapped his arm about her waist as they walked, being careful to take small steps to match her stride. Would you spend tomorrow showing William and me the grounds? Please? He planned to be her husband, so this home was a place where William would spend a great deal of time growing up, just as they both had. She nodded, pleased at the idea. I'd love to. William is such a sweet boy. I can't wait to show him all the places I used to hide from Lucy when I was tired of her nonstop talking. It was strange walking with him in the dark and feeling free to talk about anything she wanted. It hadn't been like that with other men. She'd felt she could only discuss topics they wanted to discuss. He laughed. You used to hide from Lucy? Lucy has always been one who gets an idea in her head and won't let it go. She talks nonstop about the same thing for months on end, and then finally switches to a new topic. It makes me crazy. I can see that. What's her topic now? He was fascinated to hear about this side of her and her sister. He'd always thought they were best friends. When they were small, their mother had dressed them exactly alike, and they'd been so mannerly. Charlotte sighed heavily. Pregnancy. She's fascinated at the idea of becoming an aunt. She's read books that say that a woman who carries her child low is having a boy, and then she'll read just the opposite in another book. She's certain if she reads enough books on the matter, she'll be able to tell us if the babe is a boy or a girl before it's ever born. Her voice told him exactly what she thought of that idea. He laughed. That sounds fascinating. Oh, it's anything but. If she could just read one book on the topic, and then tell me about it, it would be one thing, but she must read 15 books, and go into each minute detail of each one. I swear, if I was ever going to take up spirits and drunkenness, it would be to escape from her non-stop prattling on about silly topics. She sighed. She loved her sister, but sometimes she just was too much for her to deal with. I see. He squeezed her waist gently, hating that they were approaching the gazebo, and their time alone was about to end. What happened with you and Diana tonight? Anthony hoped beyond anything that they had discovered they could get along after all. He hated the idea of his wife causing discord between his best friend and him, but he wasn't going to give up on the idea of Charlotte for his wife. There had to be a way for them to get along together. I talked to her and gave her a chance as you suggested. I do believe we are seeing eye to eye, which surprises me to no end. I didn't think that was possible at this point. She sighed. I asked her to tell me a lie so I could see if my ability to detect them worked on her. It did. She shook her head. I thought I couldn't tell with her and that she must be lying all the time. Really? She nodded. Not only that, she said she was trying to protect me from a relationship with Miles, and that she thinks a relationship with you is a good idea for me. So if I want to enlist aid in this courtship of ours, she's the one to go to? He smiled, nodding. I shall keep that in mind. He loved the idea of having Diana on his side. She was a sweet woman with a great deal of influence over Percy, who was the only man who could stop them from marrying. I'm not certain why she cares if I'm happy, but she does seem to. It's a little odd with the way I've treated her ever since that night 2 years ago, but I guess I can't complain about how forgiving she is. She had more respect for her sister-in-law knowing that than she would have otherwise. Someone who forgave so easily couldn't be bad. I'm certain you're not the only one who's treated her that way after a similar situation. I heard many rumors of her doing the same thing with other young couples, and I know there aren't many ladies of the ton who would allow a merchant's daughter to come between them and the man they'd set their cap for. It was odd, but he actually felt sorry for Diana, trying to help people and being treated poorly for it so often, but still trying to help. It was hard not to respect her for that. Charlotte thought about that for a moment before nodding. You're right, of course. I hadn't really thought of that. I heard rumors about her, of course, but I was so busy being angry about what she'd done to me, that I paid little attention to them. I wonder how she does it. How she does what? How she makes the men forget about the lady they profess to love. What is the ability she has? I wonder if she has some sort of power like mine and Lucy's. She hadn't thought about it before, but of course there must be other women with the same type of abilities. Wait, Lucy has a power too? What can she do? He'd had no idea Lucy had some special power as well. Charlotte grinned. Lucy has the ability to see whether someone's intentions are pure or nefarious. Anthony looked at her in surprise. In what way? Well, if a gentleman asks me for a walk, I always check with Lucy first. She knows if he's just trying to drag me off into the trees, to kiss me, or if he's truly wanting to get to know me better. She shrugged. Since we were small children, we've told no one of our powers except each other. She looked up at him. You won't tell anyone, will you? She'd trusted him with the knowledge about her power when she'd trusted no one else. Maybe there was a part of her that trusted him more than she realized. He laughed softly. Who would believe me if I did? You have a good point there. I barely believe it, and I've lived with it all my life. It was good to be able to talk about her abilities openly with someone other than Lucy. Where did the powers come from? He asked. She shrugged. I don't know. Our family is said to descend from ancient druids, but I don't believe that to be true. I just know that every few generations, according family lore, the daughters of the generation are blessed with the ability to do something special. My something special is obviously the ability to see whether people lie. She shook her head. Of all things to be able to do, why that? It's an odd one. You see whether they lie? He asked. What does a lie look like? She hadn't put it to him that way before, and he was more intrigued than ever. They have this red mist that seems to cover their entire bodies when they lie. Lucy and I always play a game in ballrooms. She looks around the room and says, "So who's lying tonight?" She shrugged. They both enjoyed the game a great deal more than they should. And you would be able to spot me lying from across the ballroom? He asked in astonishment. She nodded. We were never in the same ballroom without me seeing you lie. Every single time. Gabriella as well. I guess people would ask about your relationship, and you'd both lie or something. She'd always thought it was incredibly odd the way they lied to everyone around them. That's probably it. We were always very careful to keep up the appearances. Neither of us wanted to admit what a failure our marriage was. We could barely stand the sight of each other. He hated to admit it, and dearly hoped William never found out. It was good that he'd not grown up around them both. It wouldn't have been long before he realized something was amiss. With the way they had lied though, he'd spent his whole life believing his parents had loved one another. To him, that made all the lies worth it. But you had a baby together. He nodded. We did. Because it was expected of us. They hadn't quite reached the gazebo and Abigail, so he turned her toward him, kissing her one last time. When we have a baby together, it will be born out of our passion for each other. Not out of duty. He knew his words would embarrass her, but he needed her to know just how strong his feelings for her were. She blushed, looking up at him in the dark. You seem very certain of me. She wondered if she should do something to dispel his obvious belief they would marry, but what? He wasn't asking. He was just so sure of his feelings. He stroked her cheek. I'm very certain of my feelings for you. If you have feelings that are half as strong, then I know we'll end up together. He had to believe they would marry to keep going. He loved her and needed to believe that her feelings were just as strong. She sighed, wishing she knew how to answer him. She desperately needed some time alone to think. She'd have it that night, but there would be non-stop people after the following afternoon. House parties were usually a bore, and she wished they'd found another way to be together. Of course, that reminded her that she should have accepted his invitation to his country home in Bedfordshire. Why had she argued so adamantly? At the door, he kissed her again while Abigail looked the other direction, and they stepped back into the parlor. The others had retired for the evening, so she bid him good night and went up to her room. She wished she had all the answers, but she didn't. Maybe by morning she would at least have some of them.